Good afternoon. It was interesting because we had a highly technical presentation right before this very important discussion about refugees. And I was thinking, how do you make that transition? Actually, Coons told me to think about how, because he's the boss of the world, told me how to think about that transition. And I thought, we talk about technologies and we talk about tools and we talk about industrialization or the new digital world and the digital divides, and we talk about all this as a mechanism for advancement of commerce, advancement of economies, which creates opportunity. But in the end, everything that we do is really focused on how do we advance humankind. How do we change outcomes for the people of the world in a way that makes us better, that makes us more responsive, that makes us more connected? How do we work together to solve the problems that we know need to be solved if we're going to have equality and opportunity for every person in this world, and therefore justice and dignity for every person in this world? And so I am very, very excited about this next presentation. Everybody knows how incredibly important and critical beginning to address this problem is. And so I'm going to be very quick with my introductions. And I want to say my first introduction is of my friend Chris Coons, and I knew him when he had hair, so you know how far back we go. Long time ago. And I met him in a context where people think big thoughts, and they are talking about growing that next generation of public leaders. And I knew that about Chris. I knew that he cared deeply about the future of this country and the future of the world, and that he was somebody who was going to live his life in a way that reflected the faith that he has, and I know he'll talk about that today, but also reflected the ethic and concerns that our good friend John McCain carried with him to the Senate. And I thought about Chris, and I thought about a speech John gave on the floor of the Senate that I was, one of the greatest privileges I had in the United States Senate was to listen to John McCain give a speech right after Dianne Feinstein presented the Intel Committee's report on torture. And as there was getting a lot of criticism about that report, John flew into the chamber, and I was sitting in the chair, grabbed the microphone, and gave one of the most compelling, amazing speeches that I will never forget. And it was a speech about human dignity. It was a speech about justice. It was a speech about change and his experience, which led him to believe that no human being, regardless of what they had done in this world, deserved to be tortured. And that's an ethic that I think Chris feels the mantle of carrying, that commitment to human rights, that commitment to solving those kinds of problems forward. I want to talk about Jackie Fuller, who I didn't, I don't know Jackie very well, but I feel like I know her really well, having spent now about an hour visiting with her. Obviously, when you go to work at Google, you can do a lot of things and make a lot of money. How many of you would like a job giving away $200 million a year? I think we all would. But there's a real trick to that, and there's a real trick to knowing and focus on how we can, in fact, leverage that kind of commitment from her, from Google, which now is about $200 million a year, which gets transferred to google.org. And I think she's got a fascinating story, but she's also a fascinating person. But one of the things about Jackie, and I don't mean to embarrass him, is how delighted I was to hear that her husband is a 5th grade teacher. Yay! Where is John? He's over here. John's over here. John, we all talk a lot of, we talk big, but you might be the most important person here in the future of our country. So thank you for your commitment to children. And the last introduction is for my great friend, Cindy Mccain. I met Cindy almost right away after I was elected to the United States Senate, and like a lot of you, felt like you knew her already from the work that she had been doing and the work that John had been doing. And when you talk about why do people do what they do, she has no choice because she's a mother. And just as she would protect her children and her grandchildren and her daughters-in-law and her son-in-law against all evil, she sees every child of the world as her child and her responsibility to be that mother, to be that fighter, to be that advocate. And we are so proud because she represents us not only in this country as our greatest mother, our mama bear, she represents us across the world in defending and protecting the most vulnerable people that exist in this world. We are so proud of you, Cindy. We're so proud of the work that you do here. And so I'm going to turn it over to the mama bear, who's going to lead the discussion. Thank you so much for this opportunity, Cindy.
Thank you. Thank you. I've also been called a viper, too. So I'm so glad to be here with these two people. This is a remarkable opportunity to hear from not only two experts in this field, but people that really care about what they do. And I'm just so blessed to have known both of you for quite a while now. And although the whole time I've known Chrissy's never had any hair, so I don't know what to say. Anyway, I'd like to start with this particular issue with both of you. Why? Why do you do this? Why do you care? Why should you care? Why should they care? Chris, start with you.
Why care about refugees? First, from the macro level, we are currently living through the greatest refugee crisis in modern human history. There's about 70 million people right now. About 45 million are internally displaced in their own country. They're no longer able to live where their homes and farms and neighborhoods were due to violence and instability, and about 25 million are outside their countries of origin. And the length of time people are being refugees has gone longer and longer. It's now at least 10 years on average. And the impact both on the people who are living as IDPs and refugees and on the countries around them is significant. It is one of the most destabilizing developments in decades. We've seen it impact our politics. We've seen it impact Europe. In some ways, it's driven Brexit. It's destabilizing, Lebanon and Jordan and Syria, for example, just to pick one country. Whole regions of Africa, Southeast Asia, the developing world have been profoundly impacted, first. Second, just values. My own, to be very personal, my own understanding of my faith really came to mean something when my mom led the effort of my home church to welcome a refugee family from Vietnam. It was a mother, a father, and 5 kids, and they had been afloat on the South China Sea in a raft for months. They had endured unbelievable experiences in refugee camps after the fall of South Vietnam. And my brothers and I got to grow up with the Tran family and to see them not as people in a camp somewhere on the other side of the world, but as folks who went to our church, lived in our neighborhood, went to our schools, and ended up becoming just amazing contributors and partners to our society. So for me, this is both personal and very real. This is going to play a central role in the world understanding who we are and what our values are. And it's an unavoidable source of destabilization where if we don't get a strategy right, we will be dealing with the deep values context and the security consequences of the greatest humanitarian crisis of the modern era. So why? Because it matters.
Thank you, Jack.
Yeah, from a Google perspective, it's interesting, Google.org, we're Google's philanthropy. We give about $1 billion over 5 years, plus our technology and our Googlers, our expertise. But the kinds of issues that we tend to work on are the ones where we feel like we could have a differential impact, things that align with our values and our expertise. So things like education and job skills and crisis response. We actually weren't planning on responding in the refugee situation, but back in 2015, when we saw just this huge influx coming out of Syria, we decided to step forward for two reasons. One, the moral reason. This was a huge humanitarian challenge, and we believed it was going to take all of us. It's going to be led by governments, of course, but that all of us, companies, citizens, needed to come together. So the moral reason. But the other reason is that Silicon Valley has a very different narrative about refugees and migrants because we were built by them. And we see the tremendous value that refugees and migrants place everywhere around the world, the vitality that they bring. Google itself was founded, two founders, one of whom, Sergey Brin, fled the Soviet Union, he and his Jewish family, when he was about 8 years old. He knows personally this story. Sundar Pichai, our CEO, born in India, had never been on a plane before he took one to attend Stanford University, grew up in a house without running water. So Silicon Valley has been built and is being run in part by people who have lived this narrative and recognize that it's not only a moral imperative, but there's a huge opportunity there. So when we thought about, okay, we knew Google, we're going to respond, we're going to donate, whatnot, but we also decided to do it in a little bit different way than normally because we wanted to make a statement on values. And so we did our first ever global matching campaign where we went out and we said to the public, we all need to come together around this. We put it on our homepage. We put it on every one of our products and said, join us. We can do this together. And we raised $10 million in one day. And that was an opportunity to say, this is something that all of us need to participate in. So we did the initial work, and then one of the other things that we learned over time is how important not just the immediate response is, but integration. And so our work shifted over time to emphasize more education and jobs.
Yeah. Well, assuming most, I mean, obviously people in this audience know what the word refugee means, knows what refugee situations are like from having read it in the news. But so let's start with Refugee 101 in that way, which I love to put that way. First of all, let's get on the front side of this issue. How can we prevent, in your minds, prevent a refugee situation from ever happening? Now, mine, and I'll leave out right now war. I mean, that's a separate entity in this. But when you start talking about food and security, all those things, how can we prevent this from happening?
One of the things that we've lacked is a strategy for how to transition from simply responding to crises. UNHCR and the World Food Program and a lot of the critical NGOs that provide support to people who are made refugees by natural disasters have gotten really very good at it. But the scale of it now is well beyond what anyone had anticipated or could prepare for, and the length of it, the duration of it, the impact of it has gotten beyond what anyone could have imagined. So one of the things we realize we need is a strategy to prevent fragile states from becoming failed states and pushing out millions upon millions of refugees who are then displaced for a long time. The Institute of Peace spent most of 2 years with a blue ribbon panel that included people of all different backgrounds in defense, diplomacy, development across several administrations to come up with a strategy. And then a group of us have introduced something called the Global Fragility Act, which is pushing us towards a metrics-based, transparent and predictable strategy for how to invest in development and diplomacy and defense. So if you take, for example, the 5 countries of the Sahel and West Africa that are facing enormous pressure from the weapons and the violence that's poured south from Libya and the pressures of the Sahara pushing down into the Sahel, and the fact that these are poorly governed states that have long-standing divisions. They've laid out an idea that is now a bill that's been introduced in both the House and the Senate, and I'm honored to have Senator Graham as the lead sponsor, and I'm the lead Democrat on it. We have a dozen co-sponsors in the Senate, 6 Democrats, 6 Republicans. We've got a key group of 6 in the House. I think if we move billions of dollars into a clear and defendable strategy for how to prevent fragile states from becoming failed states, we will have fewer instances of countries like Somalia going from being at the edge of failure to being literally failed states. That is a beginning. But if you look back since 9/11, we have spent close to $7 trillion over $6 trillion on combating terrorism. And while we haven't suffered another comparable to 9/11 attack on the American homeland, there are more countries where there are more terrorist or extremist groups killing more people today than at any point since 9/11. That strategy alone, a predominantly militarized strategy, clearly needs a companion strategy to buffer and push back against the fragile states that create space for extremism. So that's the strategy that Lindsay and I are most excited about and that I think can actually contribute in this area.
There's no better expert on Africa in the U.S. Senate or in the government, in my opinion, than Chris Coons. You mentioned something, if I may, for a moment here, just to give you a description of what an IDP camp looks like, or a large camp, a long-term camp. When I first went into one, I thought, well, long-term, maybe it's a couple of years, 3 or 4 years maybe. I was in a helicopter flying over an area of Kenya, and I came upon a metropolitan-looking place that looked like the size of Phoenix. It was a 25-year-old refugee camp. These people had been there 25 years. Something's got to change. They have no country. They can't go back to Somalia. They can't go into Kenya. I mean, these are the kinds of things that are going to be occurring more so, all around the world. So keep that in mind when we're talking about refugees. It's not just the most urgent flow. It's these long-term actions that have occurred that are mind-boggling that even exist, in my opinion, around the world. Can I ask you?
Yeah, just building on the ideas, clearly we need to do work around security and rule of law. The other thing is whether it's refugees or migrants or internally displaced individuals, some of the basic needs in just immediate aid, we have new technologies that can help. In fact, we were talking about that at lunch. This idea of being able to provide unconditional cash transfers, for example, that you can give to refugees and migrants either in place before they move when they're in a dire economic strait to prevent them from needing to leave, or even if they're in the camps as well, to help build an economy and to give back to the local host environment. So Google has been building some technology and providing funding to help with that kind of economic empowerment, and it gives dignity and choice as well for them to choose what they need most. The other thing that we're seeing is this need to think about jobs and education. When you're talking about the average time being in a refugee camp being 17 years, you have to think about integration. So we've been working with some of the countries who have taken on huge numbers of refugees and migrants. When you think of a place like Germany, for example, what we did there is, there's a wonderful network of local institutions and families and churches and others who rose up and said, we want to help integrate. So we gave 25,000 Chromebooks, for example, and each of them had a dashboard where the migrants and refugees could find information on education and coursework, because some of them had interrupted their studies, but they were in college. They're graduates from graduate school. So these individuals have so much to give back. So meeting them where they're at. In places like Jordan, we're working with Queen Rania to ensure that there's enough Arabic language content that's available so that people, whether you're in a camp, and by the way, the majority are actually not in camps, they're in urban and peri-urban environments. But no matter where you are, how can we bring education and learning that is personalized to where you are and to help you move along that pathway and to get you credentialed in your new environment? So, and the interesting thing, Cindy, is that when we make these systems work for refugees, migrants, internally displaced individuals, it can also work for everyone in that host country who's been left behind. So the work that we've been doing in Lebanon, for example, with the Clooney's of all people, Amal and what's his name, her husband, the idea that they led there was that they're making sure that the education and all the assets that were being made available to the local population as well. So I think that's an opportunity as well that comes with this crisis, is that we can build our online learning and job skilling and credentialing and language programs so that they serve not only this population, but others who are left behind in country.
We were talking earlier about the impact of just what you were talking about, the ability now for cash transfers, the biometric issue in all of this. And I'd like to maybe just briefly touch on that a little bit. And if you could not only describe it a little bit for our folks that don't know what we're talking about, but more importantly, the ethics and what you think, both of you feel where we're going with that.
Well, yes, because one of the things I learned when I came home from visiting a refugee camp in Nigeria and talked excitedly about unrestricted cash transfers, your average voter in Delaware is not excited about the idea of unrestricted cash transfers. First town hall I did, I got this, hang on a minute, what? Here's how to describe that, I think, more effectively. As it is, so let's imagine you've got a mom with 4 kids and she is a refugee in a camp in northeastern Nigeria because Boko Haram, a terrorist group, came and tore up her whole village, burned everything, killed her husband, she fled, and she's now in an IDP camp. Previously, she would get a certain allotment of rice and corn and cooking oil and maybe some salt, you know, just barely enough to feed her family. And those would all have to be transported either from the United States or from depots hundreds and hundreds of miles away, maybe thousands. Now, refugees are issued individual cards that prove, I am the refugee who is supposed to be in this camp at this place in this tent. So from a security perspective, it helps keep track of who's supposed to be there and who's not supposed to be there. And around the perimeter of this particular camp in northeastern Nigeria, lots of local farmers are now setting up a farmer's market, and she's allowed to go into that market, and they all have readers, and she's got a certain allotment of money, and she can choose what she's buying, what she's cooking, what she's preparing for her own kids. So the likelihood that we're going to sustain local agriculture, higher. The likelihood that the surrounding community is going to be okay with there being a large refugee population for a long time, higher. And the ways in which it empowers her to be making choices about her children and their upbringing. And she's frankly more likely to be preparing food they're more likely to eat. And that is because of what's provided nearby, healthier. That is called an unrestricted cash transfer. But what it really means is instead of getting $10 a day worth of commodities that are, you know, mass produced and from a long way away and have very high spoilage and shrinkage rates, you're getting $10 worth of value onto that card, which because of the biometrics, only you can use, and you can use locally to purchase things. It has been demonstrated to be far more effective in terms of the quality of the food, sustaining local agriculture, and the host country accepting big refugee populations for a long time. The most recent camp I went to in northern Uganda with Bob Corker 2 years ago, there were 500,000 people who fled South Sudan as the civil war really picked up. This refugee camp went from not existing to being one of the largest in the world in a space of 6 months. Without this ability to deploy directly aid and then have the surrounding community come and sell to people in the camp, the logistics of being able to feed that many people who were displaced that quickly are otherwise very daunting. It also frankly allows for traceability of how much money is sent, who's it received by, and how is it spent. There is also a negative side to this, because it means today there are millions, tens of millions of refugees where we have, or other countries have, or agencies have, very detailed, very thorough biometric records on every individual. It means we don't face the tragedies that happened after the Second World War, where families never know what happened to each other. After 9/11, remember that sort of wall of pictures, do you know where my cousin, my husband, my nephew is? This allows us to connect refugees with each other almost immediately. But where there are malign governments who want to oppress people or prevent their return or supervise or monitor their activities, it also could be used for those purposes. So we have some real concerns, I think, about the ethics and the privacy and the rights aspect of the use of this technology.
I think it's not just this technology, but a lot of these advanced technologies that we're talking about, and Google's, of course, very keen on artificial intelligence or augmented intelligence, I think President Crow said, machine learning, and but we always need to be aware of the potential dual use and all the value that it provides by serving an identity and reducing corruption and fraud and shrinkage is all great, but it also provides identity, and that can be used in nefarious ways. So we've been very thoughtful as a company as we've been working with crisis response organizations and with the U.S. government together to think about where are some uses where we can apply artificial intelligence in ways that can really advance these outcomes, but reduce the risk that they can be abused as well.
Well, we talked earlier about the old days, and that's not that long ago, about how when a refugee would make it to the door of the camp, it was paper. It was all handwritten. It was all paper. And there really was no traceability at all. So in that, too, from the issue that we work on a lot here, it helps, I believe, it will help us perhaps track, be more aware, be more secure of the issue of trafficking within the camps and outside the camps,
Absolutely.
too. So from that respect, but I was the same as your person in Delaware the first time I heard about this, like, whoa, 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 tell me about this. Can I ask you on this, with regards to the United States, our leadership on this issue, good, bad, indifferent, our leaders, are we leading, are we not leading? What's going on with regards to the United States, in your opinion?
We remain the world's leading donor in terms of food assistance, support for UNHCR, support for NGOs, so both directly and indirectly. The United States is the world's single greatest provider of humanitarian relief to refugees and internally displaced people. I will say that the administration has submitted budgets several years in a row that would dramatically cut those investments. I am grateful to Senator Graham. I serve with him on the Appropriations Subcommittee that determines what we're actually going to spend on state and foreign aid. And we just had the first hearing where Mark Green from USAID came and sort of grimly presented the administration's budget that would cut aid by 30%. And my recollection is Lindsay said, well, that's nice, that ain't going to happen. And I think the good news is on a bicameral and bipartisan basis, we have sustained our investment in humanitarian relief. The bad news is that the global commitment is steadily shrinking. You know, we're in the 8th, almost now into the 9th year of the Syrian civil war, which has metastasized and produced humanitarian challenges in the whole region around it. And the annual UN appeal for a response to the needs, you know, Turkey has, I think, 3.2 million Syrian refugees. Lebanon, Jordan are carrying 20-30% of their population now is refugees from Syria, from Palestine, from Iraq.
People who don't know that stat, I didn't know that, and so, I mean, literally, can you imagine taking the equivalent of 20 to 30% of your population in as refugees? I mean, that's why we're working in countries like Lebanon and Jordan. And you were saying, how many did we?
So if the United States took in 70 million refugees, that would be comparable to the burden or the welcoming that some of the countries around Syria are doing. The United States last year accepted 22,000 refugee resettlements. That is the lowest number since 1980. And I frankly think that sends the wrong message to the world. We have been able to safely resettle refugees to this country at the end of the Second World War, the collapse of the Soviet Union, the fall of Vietnam, the Cuban Revolution. One of the things that has held up the United States as a place that welcomes those fleeing violence and injustice around the world is that we've had robust refugee resettlement programs. Again, my mother, ever engaged in my stories, read in the paper that there'd been no Syrian refugees relocated to Delaware, and she got engaged and active, and the same church I grew up in partnered with Jewish Family Services and with Masjid al-Ibrahim, our largest mosque, and sponsored a Syrian refugee family that were blocked by the president's travel ban. Ultimately, because there was a brief window where that first one was invalidated, they were able to come. And he's actually a computer programmer, and they've just had a beautiful daughter, and he's integrated into our community in Newark and doing very well. But refugee resettlement in my home state has been shut down. The grants have been cut off. There's no more resettlement happening, and I think that is a black mark on our country. Frankly, one of the most challenging and inspiring moments I had with Senator Mccain. Senator Ayotte, who's here, a group of us were with him at a refugee camp for Syrian refugees in Jordan, and I saw him literally brought to tears with compassion for the ways in which these folks were struggling to hold their lives together, to fight, to support folks who are fighting against Assad's murderous regime back in the country and to maintain some semblance of decency and order. I think that is one of the best and highest chapters in American history, is the ways in which we've welcomed refugees, and I think we should get back to doing so in a safe and a balanced and a sustainable way. But we can't ask allies of ours to host millions of refugees and take 22,000.
You want to comment?
Amen.
You know, I think, especially coming from a border state, I think the word refugee has almost become a dirty word in the United States. And especially now because it's confused with immigration. How do we get above that? How can we stop the idea that somehow someone from another country shouldn't come in at all? You know, that somehow there's something bad about it. And I see that. You know, if I can interject just for a moment, I went down to our local IRC office, which is in Phoenix, Arizona, and I thought I was going to see a room full of Hispanic families. That's what I thought I was going to see. I walked into a room that had Congolese, it had Nigerian, it had Tibetan, it had, you name it, it was in there. And I thought, my God, this, you know, I didn't know that. And it's such a difference now, and I'm just afraid that we're going to get past this word refugee and never get back to what it really means for us at all. Do you have any, would you like to comment on that?
I think the importance of human contact, you know, it's interesting just hearing your story and how much it turned on actually having a human contact. And I think, you know, Brian Stevenson's talks about getting proximate and the importance as we're trying to bend towards social justice, that those of us who are in positions of privilege need to get proximate and really understand the people who are in need, whether refugees, migrants, whatnot. Because once you meet and then hear the stories and then are able to then be a storyteller about the incredible people and what they bring, that's when we can start to change the narrative. So we actually had our marketing group at Google who got involved in thinking about how do we tell some of the stories about these populations and what they're doing. Just one small example, when I was in Berlin at one of the refugee camps there and looking at one of the tech centers that we had built, there was someone named Ahmed who had come forward. He was a refugee himself, and you know, he was a computer programmer and someone who was so capable but was not able to work, you know, and didn't have the credentialing and whatnot, but he set up the computer center there, and through that he educated thousands of kids who otherwise were just going to be, you know, sitting around doing nothing. And so we connected him with one of our partners, NetHope, and now he's working on setting up connectivity and tech centers, you know, all throughout Germany. There's such leadership and, you know, humanity and skills that I think to the extent that we can help unlock that and allow them to be the learners, the lifelong learners and skilling and credentialing so they can plug into societies and then tell those stories is going to be a big part of changing the narrative.
You know, there is, in my opinion, there's nothing more dangerous inside a refugee camp than adolescent teenage men that have nothing to do.
Right. That's sort of true anywhere. Yeah. Let's just all agree we don't want that anywhere.
Camp, they can be really bad. So
it's a global challenge.
Yeah. My boys are perfect.
I have girls.
I'd like to also ask, because we're getting close to being out of time, how integral is our public-private partnership in addressing this crisis?
Central. I think, you know, the disciplines of the private sector bring a focus on transparency, accountability, metrics, making sure that we're able to report back to the American people how we're spending their money, what impacts it's having, how we're coming up with new strategies that aren't just continuing on the path we're on, but are looking at different ways of trying to solve problems. I think all of that comes from continued engagement with the private sector. Better understanding technology, how it can be deployed, how it can solve real human problems, and how we can defend against it being misused. All of that flows from public-private partnerships. The scale of public funding dwarfs the amount of philanthropic giving, but philanthropic giving really acts as venture capital. It really acts to catalyze better strategies, better engagement, and more sustainability in public sector giving.
I agree.
I would say regardless of the issue you're talking about, whether it's education or the environment, the engines of change and sustainability are always going to be government and markets. So then philanthropic capital, exactly, it can be risk capital. It can provide perhaps that innovation and technology, be willing to take risks, be willing to go out and try new approaches that align with your business models and what you know most. And at Google, we're accustomed to failure. We say fail fast. We launch and iterate, and so we can maybe go in and do things a little bit more quickly and with the technology. But we always ask, how can we come alongside? Because the funding that we're giving, as you say, is so small relative to governments. We come in and say, do you see a role? Is there a way that we can help? Is there a gap that we can fill, whether it's in this topic or in another topic? But the only way to get to scale is to do these public-private partnerships.
I'd like to open it for questions. We have about 5 minutes left. Yes. We have our microphones ready, everyone?
No way.
Run.
Thank you. Diana Negroponte. John Negroponte and I support a Syrian family and a young man from Nicaragua. But here is our problem. Work permit. Work permit is essential for an asylum seeker to be able to hold his dignity. If you can't get that work permit, you either go underground or you depend on others. Senator Coons, please bear this in mind when talking about these issues of asylum, that the work permit must not be postponed so that you have to wait longer and longer to get that right to work legally.
Right. I agree.
I agree.
Can I just build on that real quick?
Sure, yeah, please.
Just building on that point real quick. In addition, again, you can think of refugees as just a microcosm of a larger issue, which is people feeling either being locked out of the growing economic opportunity or feeling locked out for themselves or for their children. Google just launched a feature on our job search called remote work. So if you think about people, whether they're displaced because they're a military spouse and they're traveling all the time, but this is just huge, need for people to be able to use technology in the online world to do work remotely. And when we looked at this feature and we said, where are the most people searching on Google for remote work? I thought it was going to be like techies on the coast, It's actually number 1, Mississippi, number 2, Georgia. Right, so it's heartland America in this case. So I think that there are some tools in addition to the work permits and those kinds of things which we need to do, but also thinking about how we can match available jobs and work with where people are at.
Questions? Jim? Oh, go ahead. Oh, is it okay if we go there first and then we'll come back to Jim?
Hi, Josette Sheeran. As the former head of the World Food Program, I want to thank you and thank Senator Graham and thank Senator Heitkamp and the coalition that has supported this incredible organization. It is the Navy SEALs of the humanitarian world. If we look at the sequence in Syria with the refugees, the day that WFP put out the press release that the rations were being cut in half, the flow started. So what we know is when people feel their life is in danger, they will revolt, tried that in Syria, they will migrate or they will die. And so migration will happen. Cindy's such a champion, she came to all these camps. So my question is this, we know like in Dadaab, we can manage refugee flow. We actually know how to do this. We need food and we need tents. Ideally education, but those two things will keep people stable for years. It's amazing. And then the flow can be managed. Could we imagine a global fund by like-minded nations to make sure that when something happens, organizations like WFP don't literally have to go on begging for the stabilization money and the ICRC and others, and that it's there to be drawn down for the skillful management. And so I like to say the hard thing is getting people to risk their lives to help. The easier thing would be finding the money, which in the end is nothing compared to what Europe went through and all of these. So that would be my question, because I think the U.S. does pull its weight, but we need every nation. Could it be an assessed fund that's just there to make sure we can stabilize things? And thank you, Cindy, for being a champ.
You make a good point, or you ask a good question. The Global Fragility Act actually includes a mechanism that creates a new global fund for the combating of fragility that would be pre-funded, that would not be in response to crises. It would be a multi-year, multi-donor fund, like the Global Fund for the work against HIV/AIDS. That's going to run into some opposition. Bluntly, we have an administration that is not as enthusiastic about multilateral action as bilateral action. But I'm actually cautiously optimistic about the response we've gotten from Secretary Pompeo, from USAID Director Green. The larger point you're pointing to, beyond one bill that might do one fund for fragility that might help 5 countries, is how do we do multi-year, multi-billion dollar humanitarian funding rounds? That's a big challenge because we are frankly fighting donor fatigue globally. Every one of the rounds that the UN has been leading to try and get money for the World Food Program or for UNHCR is underfunded. What you're pointing out is that the way it's done is crazy. I mean, but it's frankly the same way that in Congress we fund disaster relief. We have the disaster, we spend the money, and then we run around trying to legislate to pay for it for 6 months or a year or 2 years afterwards. That's not how any major company or healthy community you fund the insurance and the prevention in advance to ensure resiliency. Hopefully we will graduate to a more mature way of looking at funding humanitarian disasters. And the most recent trip I had the blessing of taking with Cindy, we went to the World Food Program headquarters in Rome and got a briefing on what WFP is doing around the world. And then we got to spend some time together in Africa, and I got to see once again what a remarkable champion you are. That fierce mama bear that Heidi was talking about.
Thank you. I'm afraid that's all we have time for. I just took a glance at the clock. I don't know how long it's been at 0, so I'm sorry. Thank you all for listening. I'm so grateful to the two of you, Jackie and Senator Coons. Thank you, and keep doing what you're doing.
Thank you.
Thank you.
My friend.
Yeah.